meaningful. It's true.
All right, with this bit of nonsense, I'm looking at it's 12 o'clock noon. 12 o'clock high is the old TV show used to be, which I'm old enough to have seen that, at least on reruns. And again, let me first apologize, as I do for most of my meetings, for being an old guy. We'll do our best in spite of that. Anybody out there in our viewership who wants to ask a question, we've got Q&A button. Make sure that if you would, and you want to talk to us in the session, hey, Stephanie, that like Stephanie's son has done, if you want to say howdy, or hey, you put that in the chat. If you have a question, there's a button that says Q&A. And if you have any questions on what to do or how to get someplace, you can put it in that session chat. We will get underway now. Let me first start by thanking everybody for participating. I am Pat Clark. I'm a founding and longtime board member of our nonpartisan 501c3 affiliate, Keystone Progress Education Fund, and I've been serving for a little while now as the acting executive director of both the C3 organization and the 501c4 organization, the advocacy organization, Keystone Progress, which produces now for the 13th year the Keystone Progress Summit. And this year we made the decision to do it once again online, so that we didn't end up like the gridiron thing down in Washington. On the other side of it, we got to put up with technology, which if anybody, Stephanie will account, Stephanie's son out there on the board, they hear me complain about things every once in a while bitterly, usually accompanied by curse words. Technology is number one on my list, but we're making it work. So everything's groovy. And I thank you all. I think the board, and as I said, one of our board members, Stephanie's son, is out there participating in the audience. Want to thank all of our board members for both organizations. Stephanie's on our nonpartisan organization. And I also want to make sure to thank our sponsoring partner organization, the ACLU of Pennsylvania. They've been great to work with. They're actually involved in a couple of the sessions that we've done so far, including one that's going on around abortion access and privacy rights. And let me start by introducing the two folks. And I guess I'll start in the home state here, the home Commonwealth. I want to make sure that I introduce Gabby Raxa from Philly Counts. Thank you so much. I'm really appreciative of the work that's done out in Philadelphia around this topic, especially what they've done with the organization post 2020 decennial U.S. Census. I also want to do a special shout out to Melba Steps from Count Me in Georgia and Fair Count, Georgia, whom we are lucky enough to have. And Gabby, you can't say this because you're out east, but Melba and I are in Appalachia out here in the west part of the state. She's down on the southern end of it. And I'm so excited to have you both here because I know somewhat about the great work that you've been doing. And I really want to make sure that, Jordy gave me a shout about appreciating the virtual thing, being a country person. So we're going to get into that a little bit too. So let me start out. Whichever one of you wants to kick us off, tell us a little bit about your organization. Make sure I'm pronouncing everything right. And if I don't think we got the correction of the. Did we correct your name, Gabby? I think we did. It looks like it's right, but you'll know better than me. Anyways, let's start out with you, Gabby. Tell us a little about what you do out in Philadelphia, and I'll let you take it from there.
Sure. So honored to be here today. Thank you, Pat, and thank you, Melva, for being here as well. Excited to hear from you too. My name's Gabby Raska, as Pat said. Good job. And I am with Philly Counts. I'm currently the public affairs manager at Philly Counts. But back in our census work, I was the community engagement manager. And are we just doing introductions, Pat, or do you want to talk about the census work?
Yeah, just do a fast introduction. Let Melva talk a little bit about where she's from too, and then Melva, if you want to take it and talk a little bit about the work that you've been doing down there in Georgia, and then we'll get back to Gabby.
Absolutely. Thank you, Pat. Thank you, Gabby. Grateful to be a part of this conversation here. My name is Melba Steps, and I currently serve as the program director here at Fair Count. And just to kind of go into who we are and the work we did around the census. And also, Pat, do you want me to talk a little bit about our COVID response work too? Okay. So with Fair Count, we were actually founded in 2019 in Georgia, as Pat stated. And we started out as an organization to really just focus on census-based work. But as you all know, the pandemic hit and we had to make some pivots. So we really started out just really having that census-based work in communities that have been historically undercounted in the census. And as you know, these are often the same communities that are underrepresented at the polls. And they are also those communities that we find are often torn apart in redistricting. So we are a nonpartisan nonprofit, and our overall focus, just really with everything we do is to really focus on building that long-term power in those communities where we partner. And for us, our strength is really in our field or our organizing operations. We really kind of got all of our work based on what we hear, based on what we're speaking about with our partners, community partners, faith-based partners, whatever that may be in those communities. So I really have to say that it is not an understatement that COVID-19 upended everything that we thought we were going to set out to do in 2019. We started out with a strong, powerful ground game, knocking on doors. We were hosting in-person events. We were set to put on this huge census in the South bus tour. And when I tell you, all of that went away overnight. We had to cancel events. We had to send our organizers to the sidelines, and we even had to pull down a 7-figure media buy promoting our bus tour. So we really had to make some changes. I think what really helped us in the midst of COVID was really just our infrastructure that we had in place, and it really helped us to pivot. So, for example, we knew ahead of time, even before the pandemic hit, that 20% of our households in Georgia lacked access to the internet. So we were already starting to set up internet hubs in rural communities, and that was really already a priority for us. And so when COVID hit, because we're already putting these out, those internet hubs became like community resources. So when we had school-aged children who were being sent home and they did not have access to the internet at home, we had hotspots that were set up throughout the community where they could go sit in a parking lot at a community-based organization and sign on to this public internet access without even leaving their car or just being able to be in the parking lot. But we also kind of laid the groundwork for programs that were aimed at increasing participation among those historically undercounted demographics. So we had already started a program called Black Men Count, which we still have that to this day. We kind of pivoted that also into the voting and elections work that we're doing right now. And we also had an organization called Sisters for the Census, which now we call Sisters for Civics. Again, just pivoting that, continuing that effort as well. We had already launched our Black America Counts campaign in partnership with Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. And this campaign really provided those hard to count maps that detail communities across all 50 states. And really looking at those that were at risk of losing federal funding if Black and Latinx communities were undercounted in the 2020 census. So we had local partnerships, we had national partnerships, so it really helped again. And we could really leverage those partnerships when COVID really drove folks indoors. So we were really just trying to be ahead of it as much as we could. And just really, with all of the work that we were doing, we just kind of kept it going with some of those things that we had in place. And as I stated earlier, our organizing philosophy and our organizing work was just really at the pivot. And that means we got to be outdoors and we got to be meeting people. So we really had to pivot that as well. And so what we started to do when that happened is to really just kind of have literature that we could place on doors. So instead of conversing with residents, we just had literature that we could pass out that had information on it around how you can get vaccinated where you are. Information on COVID. We also started hosting COVID teletown halls to provide information. So we would call into up to 100,000 households. We would have experts that would be on the line that could answer questions, and there was no question too big, too small, so we could provide information. We provided PPE kits, when we were doing our organizing. So we actually purchased those. We had a full-time staff member as well as volunteers who helped us as well to kind of distribute that information. So again, we started out working just on the census, but of course, everything really had to pivot and we had to really add more to what we were considering. And, it just really feels like a lot of that paid off because in the end, we were one of only 3 Southern states that saw an overall increase in self response rates from the 2010 census. And we also have more than 50 counties matching or exceeding their 2010 self response rates, and that's 50 out of 149 that we currently work with. So, those are the things that we did to try to just still focus on the census, but pivot as it relates to COVID. So, tget you.
And that's great. That's exactly hearing all that. That's exactly what I'd hoped that I wanted to hear about from y'all. And I'll share before I hand off to you, Gabby. One of the things. Oh man, about a year ago, I was involved in a summit for community development organizations here in Allegheny County in Western Pennsylvania, and I helped pull together a panel with some folks from the United Way of Chicago and a lot of organizations out there that I had met, and the kind of the theme of that is why I wanted to bring you all in this, which is I don't know about you, but I've seen a lot of proposals and a lot of foundation information that talk about the importance of being resilient, which is all BS until it hits the fan, and it had hit the fan. And the basis of that thing a year ago was, if you're still just talking about being resilient and you ain't out there doing it, then it's all just this. So I'm so glad to have you both here, because from what I know about Philadelphia, you all did the same thing. So Gabby, let us know how that worked.
Yeah, I mean, Melva, you really said it, right? I mean, the one thing I wanted to echo that you said in particular was that these are the same communities that are historically undercounted, that are often underrepresented and under-resourced. And I like to say it's the same map, right? Because I've never in any job worked with as many maps as I did when we were with the census, working on the census. So when you overlay these issues, right, whether we're talking about crime or educational attainment or healthcare access, any of these maps, right, we're always looking at these same communities. And so what can we do to really strengthen our communities, and how does that in turn help to build out and strengthen our democracy as a whole? So one thing that I think Philadelphia did differently this time that we had not done in the past is we really invested the time and the money on the front end to make sure we got a complete and accurate count in the 2020 census. Historically, we have had to contest the count, and the city has calculated that that costs roughly $1.5 million. So why not put that money in on the front end and try to do everything you can to get those numbers right? So in the end of 2018, our city appointed an executive director to lead this mission. And then in January of 2019, an executive order was announced to the press to establish the office, and also just really solidifying the city's commitment to this work and this effort. So in 2019, in the spring, in April 1st, Census Day, we had our first complete count committee meeting. And that was really taken, I mean, all the cities are doing that, right? The complete count committee is kind of the first step of how you start your engagement. And we really followed suit from the 2010 leadership in Philadelphia on how to break out that committee and which groups should be represented. And we call it historically undercounted, because I think the census language is hard to count. And while it's a subtle nuance, language is really important. And when you put the onus on community as being hard to count, it's not really fair, right? Because the census is something that happens once every 10 years. Not everybody is educated on it. Even people who are educated on it are like, what does it mean? It's very wonky and complicated. And so if you're not counting these folks, it's not really their fault, right? So historically undercounted, I think, was one of the first ways that we really work to acknowledge the fact that it is not the community's job to make sure that they are properly represented, that is our job as a government to make sure that they are counted in this census. So in the spring and summer of 2019, our office was fully staffed and ready to go. We relied on a trusted messenger model. I think we can all acknowledge that the distrust in government has never been as high as it was in 2019 and 2020. particularly in these underserved communities. And so we understood from the beginning that it was important that the message about the census wasn't coming from Philadelphia government, but it, or our institutions, but it was coming from the people on the ground, right? People people you trust, your teachers, your neighbors, your family. They all needed to be equipped with the message of why the census, what is the census, first of all, why is it important, and how does it impact you? And so we did a couple of things in that vein. We worked in partnership with the Philanthropy Network to create an action fund, and that really allowed us to build meaningful partnerships with community organizations that are already doing the work, because historically the Census Bureau had funds available for that type of community engagement work from organizations. They did not have that this time around. So we knew we needed to supplement that. There are organizations who are already prepared to do census outreach, who've done this in the past, who are constantly doing community work, who are those trusted messengers, who have been around on the ground, know the channels of information to tap into, and they needed funding to do that work. So we worked with Philanthropy Network to create low barrier funds, low barrier grants, to make sure they had the money needed to do that work. We also created a training called Census Champion Training, and we've continued to use this model as our work has pivoted to other leading issues in our community. But this champion training is an idea that we're not necessarily just trying to persuade people, but we're trying to inform people. And so making sure people have all the information that they need to have these conversations fluidly, comfortably, confidently. And when this information changes, which we know it did a lot, for example, with the deadline constantly changing throughout the process, we needed folks who were tapped in so that we could get them those updates in real time and make sure that they knew how to talk about it and were really confident that they knew what was going on. We also worked really closely with the schools and universities, which I think made a huge difference, and our senior facilities, making sure that they understood what group quarter count meant and how to get those numbers in. It's not the same as just an individual completing the census. So making sure that they were following those protocols and they had the administrative support they needed to get those numbers in, that data in there. So I think there was a lot of effort, both working with leadership in communities, but also on the ground. And I think you need both. I think that's a really important point as well. And yeah, I mean, that was really the gist of our engagement model from the census. But what we realized was once that network was mobilized, they really wanted to stay engaged with us. They didn't want to see it dissolve, as so often government does, where it will create an initiative and be so present while they want something from you, right? But then once that's over, they're just gone, right? So we didn't want to dissolve the network. We were able to pivot a little bit after the census was complete and work on supporting the elections, right, which we knew was at risk with this pandemic, like everything was. So just making sure that we had satellite offices so people could come in and vote whenever they wanted, so they didn't have to all come in and wait in line in that same day, and being able to staff those and support our city commissioners in making sure that those elections were still able to proceed in a way that was efficient and effective and safe. After that, we were able to switch over to talking about vaccine engagement. And so we have been using that same kind of trusted messenger model, relying on our partner organizations and also our community leaders to get that message out there and making sure they have the language that they need, the materials that they need, and just continuing to be a reliable and trusted source for our communities. So I think that's really the gist of what made our program so unique and so special, is one, the time that was invested, and two, the work to build authentic relationships and sustain those relationships.
Thank you, Gabby. Yeah, and I'm gonna. I wouldn't challenge it. It is unique. The work you're doing is unique, but it may only be unique to like this small group here. It didn't happen a lot elsewhere. There's no mechanism. There's no formula for what happened during the pandemic, what you all did, and part of the reason, I mean, I've been hearing about what Philly's been doing around the U.S. Census, and obviously the follow up around COVID and voter participation. one of the things that was a surprise to me was finding out about what was going down in rural Georgia, and I happened to be doing, some nosing around on the internet, and I had heard of this woman, Stacey Abrams. I believe I had mentioned to Melva that I was all geeked that representatives from one of her organizations was involved in the summit, but I didn't know what was going on until I did a little scrounging around and found out. And the thing that freaked me out, and Melba, I think I mentioned this to you, about a year ago in April, I tracked down the folks with the organization there at Faircount and also the Roosevelt Institute that had been fiscal sponsor to start at least with the work. Because when I found out that the initiative down there was going by a brand called Count Me In, I kind of freaked out. I got in touch with folks that my business, and I'll be clear on this, I want to do the dividing line so there's no appearance of conflict of interest. This is all about the organization whose board I chair, that's a 501c4 and 3 organization, and also the organization that I'm serving as acting executive director. But my business has been doing work in the realm of community development that is people first based. So I don't work with developers if I can avoid it. What we do is work with community based organizations and the residents of those organizations. And essentially, we do a little mini neighborhood version of the US Census. We call it a community census. And we had been doing one. Part of the other approach on this was we got the big city over there in Philadelphia talking about what they did. Our good friends down there in rural Georgia are talking about what's going on in small town and rural areas. I did work with my business in Erie, Pennsylvania, and essentially left what we had worked on behind with those community-based organizations after we got the data that we were looking for. We knocked on 2,000 doors with people whom we'd hired and trained from the neighborhood, got people to answer, I believe it was about 125 question survey, which everybody told us we were crazy to try. But every time we do one of these projects, like, we find out that because we're hiring people from the community, because the community owns that data and nobody's going to use it to, like, sell them insurance or whatever it is, they control the information. We usually get 40 to 50 and above percent of a community I mean, it's not like saying go out and vote. We're like, tell us everything about you, all your problems, how many children you got, like what you'd like to see for your community, what's your aspiration, do you need a job, all these good things, and people participate because A, they're asked, B, they're asked by people whom, if they don't know, they probably know their cousin, and it works. And the thing that really interested me, besides the fact that it was called Count Me in Erie and hearing what was going on in Georgia, was the fact that what we did out of necessity, when we finished our work in 2019, boom, those organizations that continued the Count Me In process in that community, poorest by demographics community in Erie, zip code at least, and also I think it's the 16th highest level of poverty in the state of Pennsylvania. They kept doing the work, and they did outreach for the pandemic. They found out if people had any needs in the household. They found out if they had gotten masks. We distributed masks. All those good things that they did, sort of their seat of the pants, without a lot of resources, but they still managed to carry it out. And it proved really important. It wasn't timed as yours well timed as yours were, and it wasn't tied in directly with the U.S. Census program there in Erie, Pennsylvania, which I would point out did a great job, but they didn't have near the resources that Philly would have had and that Pittsburgh had. But we were able to continue that work. And a couple of things that I saw here that were important to me were what, Melby, you talked about in terms of utilizing infrastructure. One of the things that people have looked at me weird now for 15, 20 years when I say to them, what we need to do to increase participation, just civic participation, but also voter participation, is build social and community infrastructure. And people thought I was talking about potholes. They had no idea. Lately, that has changed. Melva, you talked about Communications Hub, which is, that's actual infrastructure. But the thing that you all did that also happened up and stayed up in Erie is that community-based infrastructure, the structure that used to in urban areas be filled by the local committee people for a party. Like somebody's hungry, somebody knocks on the door and says, "Hey, here's turkey. We want your vote." A lot of that has gone away. There are a lot of academics and books who've been written about that lack of civic infrastructure, the deterioration of it. And what you all did was build that and keep it as permanent infrastructure. So part of the reason I wanted to talk and have a longer conversation with you all, and also, or yins, as we say over here out west, is to make sure that we don't lose this opportunity. Yesterday, we were blessed to have a discussion around protecting participatory democracy. And we had a number of good folks participate in it. But one of them was the Minnesota Secretary of State, Steve Simon. Props to our operations director, Laura Nevitt, who's buddies with him and got him to participate. But we had a sitting Secretary of State, and he said, the one thing that grabbed me is he said, "I'm so glad we're talking about 10-year plan for this, not just like, what do we do today?" Because I never get to talk about that 10-year plan. Well, that's what I want to do today with you both, because you built this infrastructure. You're able to do something with it besides what was just designed around it that really supports your community. And I think that's valuable. And I think if you want to have a successful 2030 decennial census, the way we'll do that, especially in those communities that are on the same map, is making sure that we're delivering resources, we're building connections, we're making use of the work that you all have done. Because, yeah, those lowest participating communities in the US Census traditionally, as you said, are our communities, the places where we work, the places where we live. And we need a better approach than you see in many states, many municipalities, many counties for the US decennial census, which is, oh, it's about that time. We don't have much money, but let's get out there and see if anybody can participate in this thing. How do we do that? What's that look like? How do we work between now and, let's say, 2029 to ensure that the work has already gone into that? Anybody?
And I can definitely start, Gabby, if that's okay. And I think just kind of going into what you said too, Pat, is that for us, we really focused on, so in Georgia, we have 159 counties. And of course, the majority of them are rural. So we focus on those 149 counties outside of Metro Atlanta. And just really, as you said, we went number one, county by county, and really tried to hire team members who lived in those communities. Like we still do that to this day. That is so important for us. We now have about 40 team members with us, and we're still growing, but they are from those communities. I live in one of those communities. So, it's just one of those things that we were just very, very intentional, continue to be intentional about that. And like you also said, is that when we were having those conversations, same thing. I don't think we have what we call a one-on-one forum. So when we really talk to community members, and it's everything from how are you feeling today? How did the COVID affect you? How did it affect your family members? And just really seeing that we just completed over. So again, keep in mind, we just started this in the middle of 2019. We have just completed over 2,000 one-on-ones in those communities and just really getting that information. And you're right. People were very, very interested in providing the information. It was a conversation, it was information sharing. And those responses from those one-on-ones, that's what really guides our work. That's how we make decisions on what we do, what needs to happen, what the pivot looks like. So again, we may be in a community talking about the census and the importance of it, but when we see COVID hit, and when we see that at that time, we had workers that were in communities that had to go to work or felt that they had to go to work. And what can we do to help provide? And this was before a vaccine was even available. So what can we do to help provide? So that's when we started looking at PPE kits, because at that time they were so hard to get. It's hard for people to get their hands on PPE kits. So we literally went to work to try to secure those. We still provide those to this day. We just got a new shipment in earlier this week for kids and adults, and we still make sure that we get those out into the communities. But also having those conversations helps us to know what type of resources do we need to work on. So again, where I mentioned earlier about having those national and local partnerships, if we have one-on-ones and we're looking at the responses to a one-on-one, and we have people saying that, I'm in a food desert and it's hard to get out in a food desert. We try to work with local organizations that can bring food banks in often to those communities. We try to do the same thing with clothing drives in those communities. And we also try to have events where it's just about having fun, because so many people are just kind of stuck in the house. So now that we're starting to open back up, what can we do? Still having that social distance to bring the community back together. And at the same time, while we're out there, we provide information, we answer questions. So we talked about those internet installations and those hubs. We'll set up laptops and printers and hotspots. So again, if you just need to come out and check something, because a lot of our community members don't have access to the internet. And sometimes it's not because they can't, it's because the infrastructure for internet is not available. So we bring those hotspots so that they can check in. We bring those hotspots now that we're working on voter. If you need to check your voter registration, if you need to print out an absentee ballot application, we want to make those resources available. There's information that we can provide. We just want to make sure we do that. And I think also continuing that conversation around the census, we still do that. We're still doing redistricting work. We're still talking to community members. We actually, I think we had over 80 events where we really just trained on the census and on redistricting. We just answered questions. We provided information. And we also asked community members to create their own community of interest maps that we actually shared with our state and federal legislators so that they can see it. It is public information. We shared it also with the community so that they would know what that looks like, what people were saying their community looked like, and how they wanted to see their community stay intact. We worked also with a university in New York to really help us overlay maps. So take community of interest maps that communities help to put together and overlay that not only with the existing map or district that was in place prior to the 2020 census, but also now that the new lines have been drawn, what does that look like? So you really can fade between what the old district looked like, what the new one looks like, but also putting in some of those community of interest maps that were drawn and just see what those differences look like. And we just continue education, and our education is really still around the census. We will continue that work. We will continue to answer questions. We will continue to ask questions just to see and gauge what we need to do, how we need to pivot. We also will continue to focus on education around redistricting and advocacy around redistricting. But we also will continue around voting and making sure that everybody understands how the three really tie together. So, yeah.
Yeah, what you both have described, there are organizations out there, mainly located within the Beltway, who have come to this notion of what they call deep canvassing, as if it was like, some bolt that came down from the heavens, that you should actually take time to talk to people before you ask them to vote for your guy, and that you might want to listen. And bonus points, what I said about the old school thing where like somebody from a party would show up with a turkey, you might want to meet needs after you find out what those needs are. It ain't a revelation. It's stuff I've been doing for 20 years now, both in terms of my spare time like this, but also in terms, as I said, in community development with my business. One of the things that we had somebody point out up here, we're going to get to a couple of questions as we get in here. Jessica pointed out, if we're doing work, we might want to hire people who worked on the last census to be doing this community outreach. That's exactly my point, Jessica. I want people who are eager enough to do this work and to do the hard work and to learn how it works best through the decennial census to have a place to stick around. They may not be able to get a full-time job on it, but there are a lot of people from my experience that if I said to them, we're going to give you about 5-10 hours a week, and we're going to pay you a good rate. There are a lot of people that really want to do that and can become that permanent informed infrastructure that doesn't go away. Part of what I want to do is figure out what that looks like. How do we continue to do that? I came to it from a completely, had nothing to do with the US Census. What it actually had to do with was the policy that the Obama administration put together for the largest federal housing grant that they developed in I think 2009 and first rolled out after that, called Choice Neighborhoods, the Choice Neighborhoods Implementation Grant, that says if your public housing is all crappy and it needs replaced, we'll give you the money to do that. Couple things, just like Hope 6 did, you've got to help the people who live within that housing that we fund to make their lives better. You have to make sure that there's a path for them to not have to rely on rental and subsidized housing, maybe even get home ownership. But what the Obama administration did that I thought was incredibly wise, because it counteracted a lot of public policy for a long time, is that they also said, all right, we'll build new public housing and assisted housing. We'll make sure that you support the people who rely on that subsidized housing, but you can't screw up the community in the process. You have to do something better for the community, and there's money for that. You can't concentrate poverty and then make sure that that makes things worse, even though we gave you this investment in funding. I thought that was brilliant. And I think I mean, I know that funding is still available. That's actually where we developed, as a business, that community census model. And it was lauded by the Choice Neighborhoods folks as a best practice. There's a lot of other funding out there that could potentially, in these same communities, help invest in housing, help invest in better, more just law enforcement. A lot of programs that could continue making sure that those people who have learned from the US Census the best way to connect with their neighbors, keep doing that and work on voter participation on a nonpartisan basis. Make sure that if there is development coming to a community, that it's not a process where the billionaires who are making all the money off of developing housing for poor folks are the only ones that benefit. And the only input that those communities have is when they've got everything done and the architect's chosen, they say, well, we're going to have to put some light poles in. What color do you think they might be? Well, there's our public engagement. There are a lot of things that we could do better by having communities lead. And I think one of those things is the US Census. And again, thank you so much, Jessica, for pointing that out. There's a way to keep those census enumerators doing good work in their communities. At least I think so. My guess is you two will probably have a notion on that too.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things I wanted to touch on there. So let me see if I can kind of categorize my thoughts here.
Well, I'm going to shut up too.
One of the things that I think I'm going to continue to reinforce is that all of this work takes time. And so the fact that Philadelphia was able to start so early really allowed us to build those relationships. And like you said, hear from community what works for them, right? Really allow them to help inform our process, between our community partners, but also with individuals. We spent a lot of time having focus groups and meeting them where they are. Another thing that we were able to do, because we had started so early, is working closely with the Census Bureau from the beginning to make sure that, when they were working on getting folks hired as enumerators, that they were getting to every neighborhood, right? That we were helping them to ensure that the enumerators that were going to be working in those areas were from those areas. And that benefits on multiple levels, because you're also helping people get jobs, which is helping them to understand that you're a resource. You have to be able to provide for the community that you're asking something for as well. It's not just about getting what you want from them, right? I think, one of the things that we had done from the beginning that obviously we really ramped up after the pandemic kind of shut everything down was phone banking. And that was our equivalent of, Melva, I think you mentioned the one-on-ones, and really having those conversations and not starting with, hey, have you completed your census? Like, it's a pandemic. I'm in crisis. How dare you, right? So we started those conversations with, hi, this is the city. I'm volunteering with the city of Philadelphia, and we want to know how you're doing right now. What resources do you need? Are you able to access food? Are you having trouble getting unemployment? Like, how can we help provide support for you? And then really following through on that as well. Another point that I didn't make earlier, but I think is incredibly important is language access, right? Because if I'm not talking to you in a language you understand, why am I talking at all? And I think that's something that is often missed, but is really major. And making sure that it's not only being created in that language, but being checked for cultural sensitivity. A lot of times, these translation services are not up to par, or at least not sensitive to the different dialects and the different community contexts. And so, having those relationship with partners allowed us to get that information double checked. And huge shout out to Stephanie Sun, who's on the call, because she did so much of this legwork. And one of the things I think is really important to recognize is that the AAPI community in Philadelphia was like mere points away from, I believe it's section 203 of our charter, which is that if you reach a certain number of people, all materials have to be produced in that language, particularly for election work, but really for any city work. And so I think Philadelphia met that threshold by about 150 constituents. And like, when I tell you, Stephanie trained single-handedly hundreds, thousands even, of people in Mandarin, and making sure that the AAPI community was well represented and well informed, I mean, really pushed us over the edge to get to that threshold. And so now, moving forward, all those materials are going to be available and accessible to that community that otherwise would not have been, and really based on a miscommunication. So I think when we talk about what we can do differently, like, the timing is so critically important. And we also had funds budgeted through January of 2021, even though the census was scheduled to end originally in the summer of 2020, to make sure we had time to really close out and provide a full briefing, because in 2010, there was not a lot to go off of. When we were getting started in 2020, there was very limited material on what worked and what didn't work. And we wanted to leave something that was comprehensive as far as a briefing document. We created a full report on what we did and what worked and what could have been better. And so really making sure that all of that information is documented and stored and accessible, I think was a huge factor. And it also, thank God, it allowed us to work through all of that back and forth around the deadline. So then, we had a few more months, and then we didn't have more months. But it allowed us to be present when a lot of cities had not budgeted for that. And so, come August, September, there were no funds to continue that additional outreach that was given to compensate for the missed time from the pandemic. So I can't stress enough how important the timing is, and really meeting people where they are and making sure that you are there. I mean, as a city government, your responsibility to the public is service. And so if you're coming into my community and my community is lacking services, I don't want to hear what you have to say, right? You need to talk to me about, like you said, potholes, which might seem mundane and not relevant at all, but is actually super relevant, right? Education, making sure that my kids' schools has the resources that they need. Like, these are things that are impacted by the census. And so it all relates, and it's all in the same communities. And we really need to be able to engage authentically with these folks and hear what they have to say and be responsive to that, not just tracking your responses, but actually doing something with that information.
Yeah, I use a standard adage that I ripped off from a song by one of the members of the Sex Pistols. Anger is an energy. I also, for years in my business, have had a little tiny pillow that I got in a thrift store that was handmade and had sewn in it. Thank you for sharing your anger with me. I think one of the things you have to be able to do is go to a door looking for people to be, excuse the French, pissed off, because people have so much right to be mad. And as opposed to stoking that anger for your end, it's a question of jujitsuing. Absolutely, yeah, your street is a mess. No wonder you're upset. You do need your potholes filled. So that's a critical thing that I think is too often not approached. And it's when I talk about my work in community development as a business person, it's one of the reasons community development and planning is done badly, because the people who do it don't want to have to put up with that. They like working with drawings. They like working with developers. They don't want to hear people being mad about stuff other than the housing that they want to put up. But you have to, because people need to be heard out, and they need to be heard out by the people within their community. And and that's organizing. What are you going to do about it? Yeah, absolutely. How are we going to get those things done, and how are we going to get them filled? Mel, go ahead, Melville. Sorry.
And I think too, the thing I would say, to add, or a couple of things really, is that I think somehow we started to believe that community members did not want to participate in the process. We started to believe that they just wanted us to tell them, or they just wanted to be told what to do. And I think what we have to continue to remember, that's not the case. They want to be a part of the process. And I think, Gabby and Pat, what you said also is that being able to know that when you speak with them, you might experience some disappointment coming from them. And you also need to understand too that there may be things that they may say that someone from 20 counties over would not understand the conversation. But again, I think that's the importance of hiring and bringing in volunteers from within those communities, because they understand the culture. They understand what's going on better than anybody else. So again, being able to provide those educational resources based on what we're hearing and not so much on what we think a community needs to be told. So I think education will continue to be the key as we continue to move through to 2030. But also, I think partnerships are key. That's one thing that I think we really, really learned here in our work at Fair Count, is that making sure that we were partners, because we can't do it all and we don't know it all. So to be able to work with partners who are out doing either similar work or work that doesn't seem similar to what we're doing, we learn from that. And we learn from that in a way that we can share with our communities. Like today, I just learned, Pat, when you were talking about having community census programs. I love that. I want to talk to you more about that, and see how that really fits into what we're doing in Georgia. Is it something that maybe we're doing that's not the name we use for it? Or maybe it's something that can really enhance what we are doing. So those partnerships, I think, are also going to be key to help make sure that we're continuing to bring in better practices as we are really partnering with community members. And for us, it's really just making sure community members have the resources that they need to feel flat-footed confidence, and making sure that they can advocate for themselves is really important for us.
Yeah, and what you said earlier, and I believe Gabby touched on it too, in terms of cultural competence. And that's one of those phrases that you put in proposals and stuff like that, but it's for real. It's the way I got to this work years ago, when I wasn't as old then as I was now, but I sure wasn't a young person. But I got involved in 2004 in organizing young voters with a group that was at the time called the League of Pissed Off Voters. And I did that because nobody was doing it. There's still, that's one of those sectors that still doesn't seem to get traction and funding and investment, that people who are under the age of dead and actually are young and don't vote. The lesson from that is, if you want young people to vote, ask them, because nobody does. And make sure I'm not asking them. Make sure their family members, their friends, their neighbors, their peers are the ones asking. There's a lot of science around that says, yeah, that works. It's the same thing. In Erie, I mean, I worked in a neighborhood that had 2,000 households. Erie per capita, and I'm gonna throw some shade to Philadelphia again. Erie, you may not realize this, has a higher level of non-English speakers per capita than anywhere in the state. And we had to manage 10 languages in this community of 2,000 households. But we did that because, to your point, Melva, we had built strong collaborative relationships, actually infrastructure, a collaboration that brought together people who had all interests. And, we couldn't agree on a 75-point what we're going to do next plan, but we could all say, this project, it's going to hire people, and the results are going to help us build a community health center and a job center that we need, because it's going to demonstrably show that the people want that. And everybody could get behind that. That's the only thing you had to agree on, was that you need people to step up and say what they want. But that's it. I mean, I was talking earlier about like how frustrated I've been for years now. I'm generally an angry man, it just, these things blow me away that you don't start a process of investment by finding out what people need and want. And it's a simple thing. It's also something that's almost foreign, if not anathema, to voter participation. And that's kind of crazy because a politician goes in and tries to run for office. A party goes in and try to get their politician to run successfully and win for office. They don't, because they can't, unless they're skirting the law, work with nonpartisan organizations, those community-based organizations that are absolutely critical to build trust. And they wonder why they don't get trust. Well, there's ways to do that if your goal isn't to get Fred elected, but to get people to vote, to get people to participate in the census. And you do that by what you both said, building those collaborations and a lasting infrastructure. Some of the places where my company works already have those collaboratives. There's one that I'm about to work in that has that collaborative based on food access during the pandemic. They put a group of groups together and we're working on stuff, and that's a good thing. Other places where I do this, we have to create that. And a lot of places, not Pittsburgh, Pittsburgh has a number of great collaborative organizations, but a lot of places don't. And that's absolutely critical to be able to build trust, to build capacity, and to work with the organizations that people know and know are important to get the resources they need.
And I do. I mean, I totally agree. And I think another thing that we try to do here too at Fair Count is to really award microgrants, right? So again, another way to really empower community members who may not have those financial resources to come together or pull resources together. They have their human resources all day, but we really try to also award microgrants. And I think now we're up to and this was across southern states. We've done about 30 or so micro grants, and really it was around organizations who were already on the ground. They were already doing the work. They were partnering with other organizations in the community, and they were really working to offer some sense of relief around COVID. And the things that were being affected around COVID, but also any type of census promotion work. We asked them to really put that in there too, into their existing efforts. So again, trying to do all that we could. And again, we did that in partnership with other organizations, you know, with the funding, being able to provide that funding around doing that type of work.
Yeah, and I
Um,
think I already mentioned the micro grants that we were working with. And also, I will say, while the message can't only come from city government, which I definitely want to emphasize, we did have a really collaborative interdepartmental effort when it came to the census. Every department was required to have, every public facing department was required to have some budget money allocated towards census outreach and to have a specific person appointed as a census liaison. And that really made the work so much easier because it allowed Philly Counts to make sure that that was a unified message. So what the water department was sending out in your water bill was the same as what, SEPTA had on their ads, was the same as, it was just really, like I said, a cohesive communications outreach effort.
I'm sorry if my wife was in this, I would be getting a chat that says, "Why are you texting?" Uh, I'm, I'm sorry. There's a candidates forum coming up, and one of the candidates does not have access to Wi-Fi, and figuring out how he's going to get into it, but or how they are going to get into it. Nonetheless, and I will say, as soon as I got word that that's happening, I know we have a number of people here. And some folks may want to hop over and hear what the lieutenant gubernatorial candidates have to say. At least, again, this event is a 501c4 event, so we can be a bit partisan on it. These are all Democratic candidates. I hope nobody is offended by that. But then again, this is a more partisan event than I often do. But yeah, and it's actually that's relevant too, because one of the things that I've done over the past several months while I was working as the acting director is having to deal with a more partisan approach, because like, Gabby, you couldn't be out there like pushing one party over the other, getting people to do the census. Melva, you can't either. Even though your founder is, somebody who knows how to run for office and be very partisan, that's not this work. But I think one of the things that really attracted to me to what you all did around the U.S. Census is that very nature. Because, like I said, there's a model in our country for politics and for campaigning that has to do with, okay, Fred's running for office. I'm knocking on your door. You better support Fred. We expect you to support Fred. They don't know who Fred is. They don't know who this person knocking on their door is, but they do know the people who show up in a charitable basis on a nonpartisan level. And that's why organizations like Fair Count are charitable. That's why Keystone Progress Education Fund is charitable, because we're not pitching for anything other than the good of the people, the Constitution, and civic participation. And that's so foreign to so much of our political model, but is absolutely the most critical thing you can do to get non-participants to step up, get off the couch, and get engaged and participate. I got one question here. Let's hop on that. I'm sorry to get off. I'm getting off my soapbox. Actually, Stephanie, I know that you all did fantastic things, and the work that I've done around my community census is absolutely perfect. I will never question it. But there are lessons to be learned. I screw up far too often, and I hope to God that I learned from those. What did you see that should be done differently? And I'm going to kind of load that by saying the way I would guess a U.S. Census could go better in 2030 is to not have an executive branch that is trying to destroy the U.S. Census. So speak to any of the points that you have that might make things better in 2030, lessons that you've learned both for that decennial census coming up in about 8 years, but also like the day-to-day working with people. What can we learn?
Yeah, one of the things that we really noticed was when we had started with our Complete Count Committee, we were starting with community leaders. And a lot of those folks were kind of already in the advocacy realm. So they were used to mobilizing around an issue. They were used to communicating with their elected officials. They were kind of already programmed for this work. And we noticed that there were some gaps in more in the neighborhoods, right? Less around demographics in particular, but like kind of gaps that we could fill by hosting regional meetings. And so instead of just hosting the Complete Count group and their subcommittees, which we did spend a lot of time on, we were also able to incorporate regional meetings that had, for example, the rec center would come together with the senior center, with the local churches and religious organizations, because if we're all in the same neighborhood, we're all working with the same constituents. And it's different than if we're all, for example, in the LGBT community, or if we're all members of the AAPI community, which could be citywide, but are kind of more used to coming together around these issues. Whereas if we just go to West Philly and we convene everybody that's a stakeholder in West Philly, it's a different kind of mobilization. So I think it's just important. I think both were incredibly valuable, and I think it's important to make sure that you're not missing folks that way.
I think the one thing that I talked about too is just there are a couple of things I want to mention, but the one thing that I already spoke about that I think is important to remember that I think we really learned was community members want to participate. They want to be a part of the process, and we should not assume that they do not. And I think we need to put more work in that engagement and that collaboration and that partnership. Um, and helping everyone to really understand too that social equity, when we think about what comes out of that data and those responses from the US Census, how allocations happen as a result of that, how communities are divided as a result of what comes out of the census, lets us know that social equity really, really, it has to start with the census. So I think that education really needs to start with the census, but also the accuracy of that data. We really need to start looking at the research around that, the funding around the census, and also the testing. So for the research, just really trying to look and see and shine light on factors that contribute to those undercounts and those overcounts. I think that's going to be really important in what we look at over the next few years, because and I won't dare say the next 10 years, because I feel like we really need to get that right before then. But also really looking at the funding for the Census Bureau and what that looks like, and how can they really enhance the data collection quality, and also their internal, and we talked about their field operations earlier, and also really looking at how they can expand their efforts to develop and maintain partnerships at the local and state level, because again, community members want to participate and they have ideas, they really do. And then I also mentioned testing, and just making sure that, again, as soon as possible, that we are testing new strategies. So again, Pat, I really want to hear about this community census piece that you mentioned, because I really think about that when I think about how we really need to focus on testing new strategies, and maybe on a smaller scale, especially in rural areas and in communities that are really prone to natural disasters. And really focusing on how do we eliminate the erasure of historically undercounted community members. I think it's going to be really important. But the biggest part of that, I still go back to, we cannot continue to assume that community members do not want to participate or learn about the process. They do. We saw that in Georgia. And we saw that overwhelmingly when we would host virtual events where you can jump on and not only learn about the census, but you could also learn about redistricting. They showed up in large numbers at those 80 plus events, virtual events, mind you, that we hosted. And again, the reason we tried to do teletown halls and webinars goes back to what I mentioned, that we have a lot of community households that do not have access to internet, but we can call on a telephone and they can pick up. They were very engaged. We had over thousands that were really joining us on teletown halls, and they stayed engaged and they asked questions, and they were pressing buttons like, I need to verbally ask my question, not just drop it in a chat. And we allowed that as much as we could with the time that we had. But they were really engaged and they really wanted to participate. They really wanted to learn. And what I think about is that when you have that one individual who is that engaged, guess what? They're going to go out and talk to 10, 20, 30 more in their community like, hey, here's what I learned, and you need to be a part of this so you can learn too. So I would say those two things is just really focusing on the Census Bureau and some of those things that we've learned coming out of 2020, really focusing on the research, the funding and the testing around some of the things that came out of 2020 Census Bureau census. But also community members want to be engaged and they want to know what's going on.
Yeah, and that's not partisan either. That's
Exactly.
across the board,
That's
right?
And Melva, I love how you picked up the historically undercounted and incorporated that right into your language. So thank you. I saw that. I heard that. I felt that. And also hearing you talk about social equity and hearing you talk about the procedures and policy of the census, it brings me back to this concept of prison gerrymandering, and how in Pennsylvania we had an incredible champion in State Representative Joanna McClinton, who is our minority leader, and she really got across the finish line this legislation to adjust how we count folks who are incarcerated. So one of the things that is kind of a lesson to us, because we did not have that information on the front end, we did not know that that's how that was going to go on the front end, is to make sure that folks who are incarcerated on April 1st, that those records are being properly maintained, so that when it comes time to submit that information is already there in a nice clean package and can be sent on over, so we don't miss any folks that should actually be counted in their home district. That's something we obviously could not have prepared for this year, but in the future, just making sure that we're aware of the protocols of how those things get submitted, when that kind of point in time count has to happen, making sure that that's correct.
Same here, Gabby. I'm so grateful that you brought up prison gerrymandering because you're right. That is something that I don't think we were as prepared for. We considered it and we thought about it, but you're right. Until everything started to come out, and you had different counties that were questioning certain things, especially where we have prisons throughout the state of Georgia. And it is something that we are really looking at right now. Again, and not in a silo, in partnership. So, Gabby, I will be reaching out to you to see what you're doing in.
Boom.
So I just really love it. Like that is one of the things that we are really thinking about right now as well, and seeing what do we need to have in place again before we really get into 2030 as soon as possible. So yeah.
If I can share Melvin too,
Yeah.
with you, Gabby. When I first reached out to the folks down there in Georgia, at the end of our conversation, one of the folks with whom you were, I can't remember who it was, Melvin. I think I told you this before though. They said to me, "So I just got to ask. So you're calling from Pittsburgh? You're not the first time somebody from completely outside of Georgia and outside of rural areas is calling us to ask us what's going on. Why?" And the only thing I could think of was, what I said earlier in the session. It's like, well, we're in Appalachia too. It's just we're further north. But I think it's really critical to be able to use these lessons learned, both, like what went wrong, but also long term, like we're talking about right now. 10 years from now, we want to be able to say, these are the things that we did differently. And it's not just in terms of the logistics. Like you said, it's federal dollars. One of the things that will help it work better is not just federal dollars. California put in a tremendous amount of money into support of the U.S. Census in their state because they saw, I mean, you talk about a return on investment, you put $20 million in it, and you're going to get like $20 billion in return. I don't know. I mean, I know that's not exactly the formula. I know you both know it much better than I, but it is if I had that for my business, I'd be all over that. But one of the things that I think is important that we look at right now, we in Pittsburgh, I did not work directly in the Allegheny County Census, but I was proud to be able to say that because a bunch of years ago, I was blessed to be able to help found the State Voices Network and founded the Pennsylvania Voice Table. What happened was, for the first time in 2018, that organization served as the convener of funders and nonprofits here in Allegheny County to say, you need to cough money so that we can do this better than we did before here. And I know that, Gabby, you talked about the philanthropy network and how you worked with them. What should folks look at going forward and start working on again right now, not just to make sure that the federal money comes in? That, from what I've seen outside of that world, that's a tough nut to crack. But what about our states? What about our counties? What about those philanthropists that should be promoting this work? How do you approach them?
Yeah, well, we had an incredible fundraiser. Was one of our core staff members from the beginning, one of the first hires, and they worked really closely with the mayor to mobilize our corporate community and also individual donors to make sure that what we called the Philly Counts Action Fund was properly funded. And that, again, that takes a lot of time, right? It's you really have to be able to put the work in on the front end. So from January 2019, we really started to raise those dollars, and I think our goal originally was the 500,000 mark that had been available from the federal government in 2010, but we quickly came and surpassed the $1 million mark. And I'm really, shout out to Olivia Bacchus, who was our fundraising director, who just did an incredible job with that.
Melva, did you all have support around there? I mean, my estimation of your founder is that Stacy does this, and the money just flows. Did that happen?
So I'm not sure about that part. So to be honest, but yes, we did definitely have support around the work that we did around the census. So some of it went into grant writing. and having those grants kind of just flow through, and then also working with donors that we, again, not just for the census, but that we continue to work with as of today, as a matter of fact. So we just continue that partnership, continue that work.
And Minority Leader McClintock, I know, has done amazing things and focused on what was happening and got it done in terms of prison gerrymandering. My guess is Gabby, it's good to have her where she is, to be able to work the legislature to some level. Is Philadelphia, is anybody from any of the state census initiatives, local organizations, counties, working toward now, like figuring out like how this all works better, and if not, like how do we get that to happen?
How this all works better, meaning not specifically for prisons, meaning census overall.
Yeah, like how do we make sure that in 2030 we're ready and it works better for us and more people are who should be counted are counted?
Yeah, well, I think that the city's planning department is constantly working on that. Like I said, Philly Counts did produce a really comprehensive report on all of the work that we did from beginning to end, highlighting kind of the strengths and weaknesses. I think I don't want to start naming elected officials because then you leave somebody out and then you get in trouble. But there are certainly local champions, and you can see that kind of really evidently, in my opinion, when you look at those redistricting conversations that took place in our legislature. So again, I get a little nervous when it comes time to name drop, so I'm not going to do that. But yeah, I do believe that there are a lot of folks who are working hard on that initiative, and in local government too, in our city as well.
Oh, start early. That's one of my notes here from what folks are saying. So if we're starting early, we're a few years out at this point. If we were to make a move and say, and I am a firm believer that you can't wait till you got the right people in the room. If you got a room and you got people, you got what you need to make it happen. If we were going to move on that, what would we do? What would we together, and then anybody else who's out there, Stephanie's there. We've got our operations manager and some other good folks there. Let me see who I saw in the list here. Mr. Mark from Monroe County, or Monroe County, as I've heard it called in other places. What do we do? How do we, what's the next thing to be able to make sure that we're making progress and we're moving toward a better U.S. Census?
I think continuing to mobilize our partners and making sure that they have the resources that they need, and it's mostly funds, let's be honest, but it's not just funding. It's also the language, the materials. Can we provide you hard copy flyers? Can we provide you digital graphics to save you time from the work that you're already doing to produce those things? So continuing to support those partners and making sure that, I think, as Melva really articulated, that you're listening to them, that you are being responsive to what they need, and also allowing them to lead the process whenever possible, I think is huge. And it also makes room for government to take a step back and play a supportive role, which I think is really important.
And I totally, just to add to what Gabby just mentioned, I think too is having that relationship and that open dialogue with U.S. Census Bureau officials is just truly important. And that is one of the things that the Fair Count president is really working on. Like, she participates in those data conversations. She participates in those conversations directly with the Bureau officials just to see what's happening. And to really think through too, what do we need to do in terms of the data? I think another piece too is just finally making sure that as things continue to arise, so as we're having those conversations and those continued partnerships, that those are things that we are really communicating with community members, are communicating, just making sure they know, making sure they understand, and making sure that they understand how that just really adds another layer to the advocacy work that they're doing in their communities. and making sure that they are involved. And so they also understand how their voices can be heard and what that really means and what that really looks like and how important it is that they do that. Um, I think for us, those were the biggest things that we're really trying to continue. Those are the first things that we're starting out with. And just making sure that we continue those conversations and making sure that we continue to spend those hours just really connecting across the state on that process. And really, again, I can't say enough, just listening more than we are conversing. I mean, more than we're sharing our information too.
Yeah, one of the things you talked about, Melba, that I think is important is the data. A couple of things on that, but to start with, how are each of you in your organizations? So census is done; it's starting to be reported out. Not all of it. That's going to take a while. Little, I can't even imagine. I deal with data way too much. I can't even imagine that much. And thank God I don't have to. But how are you making sure that the community knows what happened, like outcomes of their participating, how it made a difference? Do you have plans? Are you doing that?
Yes. So for us in Georgia with Fair Count, we partner with a few organizations that are doing similar work, and we really try to make sure our messages are consistent, that we're really saying this, pushing out the same message, but in a way that fits the organization work that we're doing. So we are doing that through social media. We also have email blasts that we send out. And what we try to do is just really create and pull out and kind of push out that narrative around the census, the narrative around the data, making sure that community members understand what the net undercounts look like in Georgia, but also across the nation. We're still waiting on that state data for sure, but especially with that federal data, and making sure we're trying to tell a story in a way that it gives the data in a narrative format, but we're also pushing it out with graphics to make sure, and also trying to really paint that picture of this is what the data means, and this is how it kind of can relate to us on a local level and on an individual level, and really putting that into hard dollars and cents where we can, so that we're kind of tying it all the way back down on an individual level. So really still, and we're still hosting those teletown halls that I mentioned to really still provide that information around what came out of the 2020 census, and we'll continue to do that as that information unfolds.
So, as city government goes, our department was definitely intended to be a temporary office, with it closing out in January of 2021. So we have not been doing as much work. Our executive director has obviously been keeping a close eye on things as how they unfold. Our office has really transitioned, as I said, to first election outreach and then COVID outreach. And it's kind of a miracle that we're still operating at all. But it is really important in our work that we continue to listen to what people are asking for. So if that is something that our partners kind of seem to be asking for, that is absolutely something that we will work to provide. And, we have a really great data team who has been awesome in creating like interactive story maps and really making data accessible for folks, because I think once you're in this world, like talking about the stats and the numbers and looking at the maps becomes second nature. But if you're a member of the general public, those things don't mean anything. So like, how do you take that and actually tell a story? And I think Philly Counts has been doing a really great job with that, as evidenced through our vaccine engagement in particular. But I think there are definitely some local organizations that have been doing that work. And so I'm grateful for that too. And I think that our democracy works best when government is really working in partnership and leveraging those organizations and the work that they do as well.
Yeah, and just let me throw out any support you all need as partners, that we as an organization, especially the education fund, the C3 part of the organization, anything we can do, let us know. Love to do that. We'll, by the way, just for folks here watching the proceedings, we'll be making a number of our video presentations available after the summit. Evidently, we had a U.S. senatorial debate last night that a lot of people have been asking for video on. I think I was asleep then. One of the things that we'll do is make sure, for example, that we share this out and then also have links to partners like Philly Counts that folks can connect with. But I really would love for us as an organization to make sure that communities in a broader sense, and especially people in organizations that have been working on and want to see support and better implementation over time of the U.S. Census, get to find out what you all did and what the outcomes are and how we can do this better. So more people are gonna see you if we can do this. One of the other things I wanted to point out on the data, and I know Melva, you talked about wanting to learn more about the community census. One of the things you can't do with the U.S. Census, and thank God, is say like, well, Lucy down the street there looks like she's got some problems. So why don't we send the enumerator back with that data and say like, let me help you with that problem, right? Privacy is number one. What I've had to do with our community census is to walk that line between, no, we're not messing with your data. The only way your data would be messed with is if these community partners that have a data trust, either a formalized legal data trust or something that they implement informally. If they think it's important for this jobs program to find out who answered the community census, said they have a career need, then they can vote to do that. But I'm not making that decision. The government's not making that decision. These community-based organizations are doing that, and that's an important thing. But the other critical responsibility is nobody's going to mess with this data. This is not going to go someplace. I actually am a big believer that certainly in the community development sector, if land and property can be undervalued. So let me go back to Pittsburgh. I'm in this big house in Pittsburgh because when I lived in DC, we came to visit a friend, actually a friend I was out with last night who's up from DC. We came up to visit him and found out that you could buy a house that was like came with a third floor that you could rent out and pay your whole mortgage. You could get that for like a very reasonable 5 figures at the time. You cannot do that now. Why? Because the property, the real estate was undervalued. And the people who took advantage of that were people with money and who've made a lot of money off of real estate and housing and development, that sort of thing. I think it's the same thing with data. Right now, our nation and especially our economy takes great advantage of the fact that people undervalue or put no value at all on their own personal data until they find out somebody's using it and sending them text messages 5 times a day, right? So I think there's a possibility from that community ownership of data that it can be increasingly valuable and can have a return on the investment for the community. For example, if a developer came into a neighborhood where we have this community census and says to the neighborhood organization, you know what, we're going to call together some stakeholders and we're going to have one meeting and that's going to determine how the neighborhood is developed and what you all need. Community can say like, well, if you really want to know what people need here, we ask them all of it. And if you give us money that you would normally spend on this stupid process that you have that's not really going to give anybody any opportunity input, pay us for that and we'll share that with you. That's going to build real community equity in terms of dollars and cents, in addition to being able to demonstrably show equity by delivering on what people need, by sharing that information through a process of approval with the community, with a jobs program. Yeah, you can have this stuff as long as you're getting in touch with people and providing them with jobs. So I think that's important. I think that's how we need to look at not the U.S. Census. U.S. Census never going to be able to do that because it can't. It shouldn't. It never should. But the ability to show, as I think both of you said, that there's real meaning in people getting up and participating, even if it's just answering this set of questions. If you can show the demonstrable value of that by getting somebody a major appliance that may be broken in the home, something reasonable that is going to be demonstrably needed by a home. I think that's one way too, if I may, to long-term have an impact on the larger census by saying these same enumerators from 2020 just got you that refrigerator that you haven't had for 2 years, and they're going to be coming back to see you in 2030. So make sure you're paying attention. I think that's a good way to build on this. Is not just in terms of participation, but in that actual social equity that you're never going to be able to do with the U.S. Census data. But that's my 2 cents worth. So, last question, and I'm going to if I don't see anything else coming in from the chat here, I'm going to just put it right to you.
Can I build on what you were saying for a
Yeah,
second?
yeah. First, yeah, absolutely. Go get them.
So when we were on the census, we were especially towards the end there, we were really a tight team, and we were out there. Once there was no longer any more like strategy and like big picture things we could do, we were out there helping folks to like, hey, this is the website. You want to use my tablet? You can do the census right here, right now. Like, I'm happy to answer questions you might have, like everything but the actual enumeration, which we were not allowed to do, but like everything short of that, we were out there doing in parks, in grocery stores, like anywhere. Since then, since working on vaccine, obviously there is a lot of funding available for vaccine outreach. And so our work has been able to expand even. And so we now have a team of canvassers, and we train them on city resources so that they can help folks on the spot access the different kind of services. A lot of times it has to do, a lot of these communities are experiencing severe violence right now. And so it has to do with victim services, violence prevention services, behavioral health. Obviously, there's a lot of, I think we're all witness to the drug crisis that's going on, the whole other epidemic that's happening in our world. So resources around that, food scarcity, all these things. And so making sure our canvassers are trained not just to talk about vaccines, but to talk about other resources that these communities definitely could benefit from. And then to take it a step further, we've been able to expand that even to have community health workers. And so those folks can take the information from the canvassers and follow up and go further, right? Because really people need more than one touch point. And a lot of times these city services, or any services really, can be difficult to access because they're in high demand or because they require internet connection, which Melva continues to reference the digital divide. I haven't referenced it one time, but it is stark in Philadelphia. So I do want to say we are aware. It is why we spent most of our funding on actual physical materials and face-to-face interaction as opposed to digital messaging and television ads and things like that. So I think that having those community health workers is an opportunity to take the information we've gotten from the canvassers and go back and say, were you able to connect with these services? Is there something more that I can do to connect you to them or to provide additional services? And really building those relationships, because I think when we're talking about historical distrust, unprecedented government distrust, the only way to repair that is continuous, authentic support for these communities in ways that they need, and not just in ways we assume that they need. So I just wanted to add that too.
I knew I would like you, Gabby. Anything to add, Melva, on that?
No, both of you brought that home. Nothing to add. That was awesome.
Groovy. All right. Well, I'm gonna before we finish up here in a minute, I'm just gonna ask you, Gabby, are there next steps? Is there a plan for integration of Gritty in your work this year?
I think, Gritty will definitely show up and support Philadelphia in unexpected and exciting ways.
Well, in the spirit of collaboration, I happen to have a couple of folks that I know over at the Pittsburgh Penguins organization. They never get me free tickets, but I know them. I don't know. Maybe we could do something with that Penguin and Gritty sometime to encourage participation on a nonpartisan basis. Who knows? But I would love to be able to do that, if only because I have freaks in my family that their whole household is Detroit Red Wings fans because they're back in Michigan. That's just my coffee cup. I grew up in Michigan, little tiny town. But I don't know why, Catherine and her husband are Flyers fans. I don't understand. And they hate me because I'm a Penguins fan. I mean, I like the Red Wings too because I grew up there. So if only as like throwing out some little morsel to my family to say like, yeah, I'm working with Gritty. that may well make me the greatest uncle of all time. I don't know, at least in their two eyes. So
Well, not only am I bipartisan, but I am also unbiased. And I will say we have a lot of fantastic. We've got our Philly fanatic. We've got the Union Snake. We've got some great mascots in Philadelphia. So let's not leave them out now.
Oh, that's the thing with the tongue. I just don't even start with me. Oh, Lord have mercy. All right. So, and if I had to count the number of times in anger that I have used the phrase "Lord have mercy" in the last 2 days, that one was a good one, though. So, well, Melva, Gabby, thank you so much. I knew that I was going to enjoy collaring you and getting into this session with you. I'm so appreciative. And yeah, you'll be hearing from me, and I hope I hear from you. We look forward to following up. Thank you, everybody who's spent the time here. I will remind you that 3 o'clock, if all goes well, knock wood, we will be hearing from Jamie Raskin. And we're going to have a chance to get some opinions on American democracy from him. And then at 4 o'clock, I am so proud to say that we're going to have an assistant police chief from the U.S. Capitol Police at 4 o'clock to receive our Anna Berger Award to honor all of the police force, especially those who were injured or died in the line of duty, actually protecting American democracy at the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021. So I hope people can join us. Thank you so much for being here, all the participants and the folks who showed up to hear us talk. Have a wonderful weekend when you get to it. Look forward to have a chance to cross paths with you all again soon. Much love. Thank you, Mark. We look forward to hearing from you too. Enjoy the rest of the summit.